when we look back over these 69 years that the trial lasted, what could the BJP have done better, or what can it still do now after all these years? So it should place this particular case in the larger context where it belongs, namely the problem of Islamic iconoclasm. Every Muslim is a Sita, that is to say, an abductee, and must be liberated. I mean, if you want to make Rama relevant in this day and age, this is how. Bring back all the Sitas. Okay, we're going to talk about Ayodhya. 3 debates about topics that people have different opinions on. So, in the ancient period, there was Rama living or maybe not living. And so the question is it true that Rama lived in Ayodhya? For the medieval period, we ask if it is true that Hindus had built a temple at the contentious site, that it was a pilgrimage place celebrated as Rama's birthplace, and if so, why did it disappear? And then we have a question on the contemporary age. It's not so much about what is happening, but what should happen. What should be done with the contentious site at present? So, was it Rama's birthplace? We have the testimony of Valmiki, but not much else. We have a little bit more information about Rama, namely we have the king lists from the Puranas and from partly the Mahabharata and a little bit of the Vedas also. And they are very important. In the case of Egypt and Mesopotamia, we would not have their history had it not been for their king lists. And the same goes for India, except that in the case of India, somehow the scholars say, oh no, this is all fantasy. What we've done in Egypt and Mesopotamia, we can't do in India because Indians, are not capable of writing history. Now, generally, it turns out that the state finds a scriptural claim enough. Like, for example, it has all these Muslims go to Mecca. It facilitates this journey. For some time, it has even been sponsoring the journey. I'm told that that is finished now. But so they are not asking these pilgrims, now first prove that Muhammad lived there, or that, Adam and Abraham lived there, or whatever the reason is for your pilgrimage. We can't accept it unless you prove it. That does not happen, does it? For example, the question is acute because now, recently, historians have started doubting that Muhammad lived in Mecca. They say that Mecca did not exist until 50 years after the death of the Prophet. And that archaeologically you can't find anything in Mecca. You see, in any old city, like Kashi or Ujjain or so, if some building company wants to erect a new building, first they do digging, make a big hole in the ground so that they have room for the foundations. And on that occasion, all the archaeologists come flocking. Because, of course, the digging that the building company does is not according to the rules of archaeology, but still, whatever object they find might be important. Well, you see, in Mecca, they've done a lot of building, and yet the archaeologists have not come home with anything. So The question might be asked, but it's not for the government to ask that question. You see, as long as there are people who want to go on pilgrimage to Mecca, the reason why they go there is not important. Or, for example, in France you have a pilgrimage site for the Virgin Mary, where she supposedly appeared to a schoolgirl. And so the most French governments since the 19th century have been militantly secularist, and they laugh at these beliefs. And yet they have always facilitated this pilgrimage. You see, they don't question it, at least not for political purposes. In India, you have a crucial legend of Saint Thomas coming to India and even being martyred here. Now, that legend is not true at all. When I was a student, our professor of comparative religion was a Jesuit. And even he already taught us that Saint Thomas never went to India. He may have gone to Afghanistan, maybe just the northwest frontier of Pakistan, because the only source we have about him, which is also apocryphal and written 200 years after he lived, he goes to a Persian-speaking desert-like territory, which is eastern Iran or Afghanistan. And the lush vegetation and so on of Kerala is nowhere to be seen. The people also have Persian names, not Malayalam. So you see, this Thomas story is really just a legend. No politician is asking questions about this. You know, as long as there is this St. Thomas legend alive among a section of the Indian population, they just accept it. So, according to the secularists themselves, not even only in words but in deeds, the very existence of a belief is what must be taken into account in deciding a policy. So, the fact that there are some people who believe that Rama was born there and who go on pilgrimage there because of that is enough to accept that practice. And so Romlea Tapar's remark that the real question is, did Rama live there? No, that is not the real question. Was there a temple at the site? Now, the archaeological findings don't go back farther than the middle or a bit more than the second millennium BC, like 1700 BC. So, of course, this is long ago and so on, but nevertheless, archaeology is worth something. So probably there was no life there at that site. Of course, Ayodhya is a big place, but still at that site particularly, there seems to be nothing. Now that's okay, because in a reasonable calculation of when Rama lived, well, he lived just about that time. There is an excellent book, Geography of the Ramayana, by Jijit Nadumuri Ravi, that explains all this. So he sees 3 different possible dates. He chooses the highest one, in which case Rama would be born about 1920 BC. So the archaeology just doesn't go that far, but the dates in archaeology are always give or take a few centuries. So that's not entirely impossible. However, what is a bit of a disappointment is that it doesn't go farther, because why was Rama born there? He was a prince in the Solar dynasty. The Solar dynasty goes like 2000 years earlier than Rama, already existing in Rama's day. that's not the case. However, it turns out that the city Ayodhya, called Ayodhya, was moved several times. So it is said that Manu, the patriarch Manu, distant ancestor also of the Vedic rishis, that he set up a capital called Ayodhya. But so that capital seems to have been moved a few times, but taking the name along, which happens more often in world history. And so this Ayodhya was built by Aja, who is the grandfather of Rama. You can also see during the career of Dasharatha, his father, within this city, within like larger Ayodhya, there is already a movement several times. You see, populations are being transported from here to there. Then the river, you see the so-called Ramkot, the castle of Rama, lies near the riverside, but high up, it's on a hill. And I've been there. I mean, it is really on a hill. Nevertheless, the river makes the whole place move. I mean, what is now near the river may be 100 meters from the river, just only 100 years hence. So that way, the exact locus is not that clear. We also know that the river flooded several times. And there are indications in the Ramayana, though it is a bit embellished, that it is in a flood that Rama died. Okay, now, nevertheless, not everybody is happy with this archaeological dating. You see, the top archaeologist, the late B.B. Lal, once spoke in Ayodhya to a gathering of sadhus. And so he said, yes, you see, I've done this digging. That was already in the 1970s, when, you see, after he let Indira Gandhi know what his findings were, namely that he found the pillar basis of a Hindu temple, she prohibited him from telling anyone. Anyway, but so by 1991, he could be open about it. And so he said, yes, you see, I know that there was a temple there. Now that, of course, everybody applauded. And so it means that the communist eminent historians were wrong in denying that there had been a temple there. But the ancient part they didn't like so much. You see that his digging finds human habitation until the second millennium, but not beyond. You see, they believe very high dates for Rama. Like, for instance, if you take the Puranic theory of the four world ages seriously, then the Mahabharata war took place in 3139 BC. The end of the Dwapara Yuga took place in 3102 BC. And then the Kali Yuga started, which is going to last in total of 432,000 years. So we're only 5,000 years onwards. And before that came the Dwapara Yuga, which was 864,000 years. And before that was the Treta Yuga, in which Rama lived. So Krishna comes at the end of the Dwapara Yuga. In fact, it's his death that marks the beginning of Kali Yuga. And so the entire Dwapara Yuga intervenes, and before that you have the Treta Yuga with Rama. This means that Rama lived about 1 million years earlier than Krishna. Okay? Now, so if you say, well, I find things until 4,000 years ago, that's disappointing comparatively. Even if not so drastic, still, I mean, the date of Rama is usually supposed to be earlier. Certainly, if you go by the traditional chronology of the Mahabharata, because the Ramayana definitely happens before the Mahabharata. So that would make it at least 5,000-6,000 years ago, at least. So that's not the case. And so when he noticed all this commotion, Bilal said, well, wait a minute, I'm not saying anything. It's my spade that tells this. The scientific method. Which, by the way, confirms the scientificity, the objectivity of his findings. You see, some of the eminent historians have said, no, he has become a Hindutva militant and so on. No, very much a scientist. You could, of course, also find a way out, but then the site would not be very exact anymore. There is a story that Vikramaditya at a later date found Ayodhya back after it had been abandoned. Indeed, you see, Ayodhya floods. That's at the time that Rama dies and the population leaves the city, or the survivors at least leave the city. And the city gets forgotten, and it gets overgrown by the jungle and so on. And so much later, it is Vikramaditya who finds the city. Now, that story on the face of it is very likely unreliable, because it may be that a later ruler has a certain interest in glorifying a certain place, in institutionalizing that place. And so this story may be a way of legitimizing this. And these things are hard to verify. This is very distant history. But then you see, if that means that Vikramaditya picked just any place of his convenience, then that means that this isn't Rama's Ayodhya. Okay? So if we really want to find his birthplace, that's a bit disappointing. Nevertheless, for the question of whether the pilgrimage should be protected today, it makes no difference. You see, the pilgrimage is already 2,000-3,000 years old. That's more than enough to respect it. Why did the temple disappear? Now, you have to see that Hindus were very attached to this temple. You see in later centuries that they always come back to this site, even when it is under Muslim occupation. You see, clearly for them it was not just any place, and so they rebuilt it. That's why you have several layers. So it's not Hindus who removed it. You see, if perhaps the building got dilapidated, they would have taken it apart and rebuilt it at once. So it's someone else who removed it. Now, the people who build mosques have themselves witnessed very many times that they destroy temples. Indeed, there are Muslim sources that say the same thing about the Ayodhya temple. And moreover, this is not limited to India. This already existed before, when Islam only existed in West Asia. And indeed, it goes back to the Prophet. When he entered the Kaaba, he immediately destroyed all the idols that were in there. And later, Muslim temple destroyers take that as their legitimation. So they're only emulating the Prophet. Imagine that the place was destroyed, but not by Muslims. In that case, they should have no objection at all to restoring it as a Hindu pilgrimage site. You see, if they didn't demolish it, well, so much the better. Okay? But then what is this mosque doing at the site? That's a bit strange. So at any rate, for as far as our documentation goes back, we see that all three, Europeans, Muslims, and Hindus are in agreement that there was a temple destruction scenario, that the temple forcibly made way for a mosque. So let's consider the Islamic doctrine of iconoclasm. We can unfortunately not rely on a direct testimony. Of many other temples, we have direct testimony, like for instance of Mahmud Ghaznavi's destruction of the Krishna Janmabhoomi and of the Somnath temple, Aurangzeb's destruction of those same two and of the Kashi Vishwanath. Here, we almost had a source just too good to be true, and effectively it is not true. It is the diary of Babar. So Babar went to Ayodhya and he kept a diary on what he did there. So this is the best source you can have. I mean, of course, you have to take into account that Babar may have been self-serving in his account and so on. All these things, you know, a historian knows that he has to take that into account. But nevertheless, it would have been priceless if we had his own description. But unfortunately, we don't, because the storm wind came and blew away a number of pages from his diary. And so in a later entry in his diary, he describes this incident with the storm wind, but so the vital pages have gone missing. Nevertheless, what happened there or must have happened there follows a pattern that we see thousands of times. So we're not just making anything up. Now, of course, the eminent historians have denied or minimized this temple destruction. And they got help from an American self-described Marxist historian, Richard Eaton, who describes temple destructions and actually admits temple destructions but minimizes the number. And so the Indian historians quote him as saying that only 80 temples have been destroyed. There is a book by Kashinath Pandit about the Islamization of Kashmir, where he describes that one Muslim preacher, Al-Araki, goes around a very thinly populated area, Gilgit and Baltistan, and even there, he alone already destroys more than 80 temples. So this 80 is a very unlikely number, but fortunately it is not really 80. You see, Eaton describes 80 cases of temple destruction. But what is a case? It's not one temple destroyed. For instance, he says that the Turkic invaders in Kashi in 1194 destroyed 1,000 temples. That's one case, okay? So Hindu counts of 60,000 temples destroyed and so on are not too far off from Eaton's description. More interesting is that he gives a new reason why this happened. Okay, I'll come to that in a second. Let's first mention a few other lies being told about the temple destructions. A very famous case is by Pattabhi Sitaramaya. He was Mahatma Gandhi's candidate for the Congress presidency against Subhash Chandra Bose sometime in the late 1930s. So he was very Gandhian, and so he was very wedded to the ideology that all the religions say the same thing, and Hindus shouldn't blame Muslims for anything, and so on. He came up with this story, for which he gives no source. He says that when he was in jail, he met a Muslim Maulvi who told him this story and who promised him to send him the sources, but he never did. And so there's no source for this, but he claims that the destruction of the Kashi Vishwanath by Aurangzeb took place because Hindus had asked for it. You see, some Rajput family in the service of Aurangzeb, when they passed by there, they wanted to visit the place. And so this Rajput general's wife was abducted and mistreated by the priests of the temple. And to punish these priests, Aurangzeb destroyed the temple. Now, I mean, this is a ridiculous story. That temple served thousands of pilgrims. They get all punished just because this priest misbehaves. No. Anyway, it's totally uncharacteristic for Aurangzeb's career. So, it's just a silly sob story. But as a Gandhian, it seems that this Pattabhi Sitaramaya loved to believe it. For example, we can take on Richard Eaton's theory, that is now very popular, denying the temple destructions won't work anymore because the eminent historians who told these stories have been defeated quite visibly. But the next line of defense for them is to say that yes, temple destructions happened, but it is the Hindus who are to blame. So this is as follows. Eaton says that Hindus had also destroyed many temples of each other. Now, in the case of Mesopotamia, for example, we know that there existed a practice of idol abduction. You see, when you won a war, you officialized your victory by taking the main idol from your opponent and taking it home and putting it in your own temple, consecrating it and restarting the worship. So what happens in those cases is that the worship continues at both places. So let's say that a Hindu king kidnaps a Shiva idol from his opponent. Okay, so he takes the Shiva idol home and he starts Shiva worship in his own temple or builds a new temple for it, but at any rate he continues the worship of that Murti. And the other place, you see there you have a temple where the Murti is gone. Well, they are perfectly free to install a new Murti and consecrate it and restart the worship. So at the religious level, nothing changes. It's only a material object that changes hands. Moreover, this is not approved of by Hinduism. It's still theft. You see, there in all these lists of virtues of what to do, one steady element is asteya, non-stealing. So it's still theft. You shouldn't do it according to Hinduism. But okay, it's not worse than what it is. It's only theft. Whereas iconoclasm has a far deeper meaning. It is an attempt to destroy a religion. And so, you see, there would be a similarity if you can find a case where Mahmud Ghaznavi or Aurangzeb or any other Muslim ruler takes the idol from his opponent's temple, takes it home and starts worshipping it. And so if you can show me a case of a Muslim ruler worshipping a Shiva Murti, okay. Moreover, here you can see how history is made in India. This is just something that he would like to believe, but there is no actual document of any Muslim ruler destroying a Hindu temple. And mind you, stealing an idol is something else than destroying it. That's also not the same. But at any rate, there is no case of a Muslim ruler saying, look, I am doing this because I am following the example of a Hindu ruler. The Hindus do that, therefore I do it too. What is this nonsense? You see, they are certainly not going to follow Hindu example. They follow Muhammad's example. And so all they needed for, as legitimation of their temple destruction is the example by Muhammad. Hindus don't come in, mostly also they didn't know about the Hindu history. They came from all the way in Arabia or Uzbekistan or so. What did they know about this local history? So this is totally fanciful. So we know that there was a hostile replacement of a Rama temple by a mosque. That we certainly know. There's no doubt about this. However, there is quite a lot here that we don't know. Far more than the Hindu scholars thought, in fact. Okay, now the first time that the temple was destroyed, in my opinion, is in 1030 by Salar Masud Ghaznavi, who is the nephew of Mahmud Ghaznavi. And he occupied the area of Ayodhya back then for only a short time, because in 1033 he was defeated by Hindus in the Battle of Bahraich. And so he was a temple destroyer like his uncle, so it's quite sure that he destroyed this Rama temple. We know at any rate that the Rama temple disappears because it makes way for the rebuilding and in fact a grandiose building of a new temple. This is the Rajput temple. All the dynasties in North India at the time were Rajputs. So a new temple gets built much bigger. It is that temple of which we have found the pillar bases and other remains. But what happened to it? Many Hindus say or assume that this is the temple that was destroyed by Babar in 1526. But that is hardly possible. You see, as Syed Shahabuddin, the leader of the Babri Masjid Movement Coordination Committee, said, and he was totally right, if the Muslims were such iconoclasts, how could such a major temple and center of Hindu pilgrimage have remained standing for 3-4 centuries under Muslim rule? And indeed, Ayodhya was a capital of the Sultanate, or a provincial capital, so there was a garrison there. You see, there were Muslims in strength, just passively looking at this Hindu temple for 300 years. You see, that is very unbelievable. Of course, they destroyed that temple. Moreover, during the scholars' debate, 1990-91, archaeologists, both from the temple party and from the anti-temple party, said that the architecture is typical of the Sultanate period. That is to say, it must have been built 1300 or so, before Babar. And so the inscription on the gate before the mosque said that it was built on Babar's command. So I'm pretty sure that in 1194 or 1193, when the city was conquered by the troops of Muhammad Ghori, here again by a nephew, Shah Zuran Ghori, all the temples were destroyed. Like, for instance, there was a mosque built in the name of Shah Zuran Ghori on the site of the temple for the first Tirthankara of the Jains, Adinath. Now there is a temple again, I visited it. But so he destroyed all the temples that he could find. Why would he leave this premium temple untouched? So more likely they replaced it with a mosque building, and that is the Babri Masjid. when Babur conquered India, for a while there was chaos. Now, given that Hindus always kept trying to come back to their site as closely as possible, in this case they may have seized the opportunity to at least restart Hindu worship at the site. You see, it was too chaotic and so on to actually do the building work of a new temple, but at least functionally it could be a new temple just by starting worship there. And then Babur came there and he stopped that. So the destruction that Babur wrought may not have been much more than stopping this temple practice rather than destroying a temple building. But we don't know because we have no description of what exactly happened. And we know that the earlier temple was destroyed, but even archaeologists can't say when exactly this was. So I think this is already a third case of destruction, though the word demolition does not apply. There are two demolitions so far, and then there is the stopping of this Hindu practice at the site. It's not, I mentioned here, archaeologists are not of the pro-temple side. There's also Sushil Srivastava, not an archaeologist, but okay, he's entitled to his opinion, and in this case I think he was right. There was already no temple building anymore by the time Babur came. But so this is very much in dispute and it's hard to decide. And now even less because there's nothing to dig up there anymore. Yes, okay, so Shasvarang Ghori wrought a lot of destruction. So it is very unlikely that he left the Rama Janmabhoomi temple standing. So what is the result of this? By the time of Babur, we know that a major Hindu temple had been standing there, that it is demolished twice, and the second time replaced by a mosque, that Hindu pilgrims kept coming to it, especially on Ram Navami, and that all the relevant Muslim sources, as well as Hindu ones, as well as European travelers, confirm the story that there was a temple there destroyed by Islamic iconoclasm. There is one element I haven't really treated yet. It is the possibility that Aurangzeb did anything there. And I think that that is likely. And again, you see here, it is disappointing that we have so few sources. Why? Well, you see, okay, Babur reaffirmed the Muslim presence at the site. But then came Akbar. And so Akbar in his young days was very much a jihadi, but later on he mended his ways and he became very tolerant. And he allowed most Hindu temples to come up again. So that's why, for instance, the Kashi Vishwanath was destroyed at least twice. So this the last time by Aurangzeb. So it was rebuilt and then it was re-destroyed. Now, here also, it is quite possible that the place came up again, not necessarily rebuilt, but at any rate, functionally a temple, used by Hindus as a temple. And that this then was again stopped by Aurangzeb. But so here we have Aurangzeb specifically giving instructions about the Krishna Janmabhoomi, about the Kashi Vishwanath, about the Somnath temple, about Rama. I don't know. I mean, something may turn up, but I haven't seen it. So possibly the temple was destroyed 4 times. Twice the building was destroyed, and twice more, apparently the Hindu presence, the Hindu use of the site was also stopped again. Last time by Aurangzeb. Now, many Hindus take a very mistaken view of why they did it. There is, of course, the Hindu nationalist view, which is deplorably nationalist in its outlook. You see, at that time, in around 1990, I heard the RSS always say, "Oh, the national god Rama versus the foreign invader Babar." Now that has nothing to do with it. That's a complete misstatement of what exactly happened. That Babar was foreign is absolutely not the problem. You see, the Kushanas came and they became Buddhists. The Greeks came and they became Vaishnavas or Buddhists. And so on. The British came, they did not become Buddhists or Hindus, but at least they started taking care of all the old temples, doing archaeological research for the first time, deciphering Sanskrit manuscripts, deciphering the Brahmi script, and so on and so on. They didn't destroy temples. They were foreign, they came here for their own interest, they destroyed India's economy, and so on. They did a lot of harm. They did not destroy temples. So the fact that Babar was foreign is totally beside the point. And similarly, native converts like Malik Kafur, for example, also destroyed temples. So this foreignness has nothing to do with it. Then the personal character of the people who did it is again a story I hear a lot. Oh, and Aurangzeb was cruel and so on. Like recently there was this pro-Aurangzeb publication by Audrey Truschke, American professor. And so, okay, she says a lot of nonsense, but she's correct in giving a fairly positive assessment of Aurangzeb's character. Aurangzeb was a very pious man, very frugal, very ascetic. His father had wasted an enormous amount of public money on his own fancies, like on building the Taj Mahal. And so Aurangzeb came to power by killing his brother and arresting his father, giving his father a house arrest in a tower overlooking the Taj Mahal. It's a bit of sarcastic. Oh, you like beauty? Okay, you can lifelong have a look at your own Taj Mahal. But at the same time, he was very frugal. He didn't want any income from state money. He used to stitch, or how do you call this? He used to make these skull caps that Muslims wear, and he used to make calligraphic copies of the Quran. So there was something to be said for Aurangzeb. And this doesn't go against the fact that he also destroyed temples. Of course, there are numerous silly Hindus who will say, oh, but Muhammad would never have condoned these temple destructions. And he was a nice man, but his followers didn't understand. No. This goes back to Muhammad. And it is because Aurangzeb, halfway through his life, suddenly got religion and got serious about Islam, that he decides to revise Akbar's policy of toleration and destroy all these idol temples. So the piousness and asceticism of Aurangzeb come from the same source as the iconoclasm of Aurangzeb. And so the character of Aurangzeb is not what concerns us here. The ideology that motivated him, that is what is important. Aurangzeb is long dead. You don't have to worry about Aurangzeb anymore. But that ideology, now that is persisting. Like now in Nagorno-Karabakh, Armenia, which has just last week been conquered by Azerbaijan, the Christian churches are being demolished and all the Christians are running away. So this is a very quick ethnic cleansing, a complete cleansing of all the Armenians in a week time. And so there they practice iconoclasm today. Doesn't have to wait. It's not 400 years ago or so. No, it's today. Okay. Then there are a number of British gazetteers published in the 19th century that all confirm this story. But as sources, you see, the scholars have brought them all together to bring all the documents together that prove the point. But as proof, they don't weigh very much because they are only a copy of local tradition. A bit more weighty is the fact that there are many Muslim documents that confirm the story. Muslims too believed, and they didn't mind, that the mosque was built forcibly in replacement of a temple. Now, in 1885, Hindus went to court to reclaim the site, and all the parties concerned were in agreement about what had happened, namely that Muslims had destroyed the temple to make way for a mosque. Also the Muslims, also the British judge. But, you see, the British didn't want to have any trouble. So they said, well, you see, okay, it's a pity, but as this happened 300 years ago, we can't reopen the case now. When the issue became contentious again in the 1980s, that would have been a possible position. You see, you could say, well, yeah, it doesn't really matter anymore. But you could take that argument in both directions. You could also say, okay, let's rebuild the temple. Let's not stick to that mosque. That mosque is not that important. That you could also, but anyway, that's not what they did. You see, suddenly it was decided that the Babri Masjid had become the Mecca of secularism, that it must be absolutely defended. Well, so that very reasonable outcome was not tried. And so the preceding centuries, before the 1980s, the question had been, can Hindus rebuild the temple at their site? So this British judge had said no, but you could just as well say yes. After all, it's a small affair compared to everything that an Indian government has to look after. Now, the so-called eminent historians who made a statement in 1989 denying this history, make the question into, was it ever their site? Now, meanwhile, documentary and archaeological evidence have amply proven that yes, it was their site. We'll come to more evidence in a minute. And so, because the secularists had made that the issue, whether there had been a temple there, suddenly they had no leg to stand on anymore, because yes, there had been a temple there. However, the media made sure that nobody heard this. And so in the West, there are still very many people who think that there was never a temple there. In India now, it's become hard to get away with that. But so people who don't follow it, who don't know, they still think so. It's only the people who were there, including the eminent historians, who will now just look the other way. They don't like to be reminded of their defeat, but they're not going to actually repeat the position they took at the time. Now, the whole question of was it ever a Hindu site and so on, some people have made fun of this, saying, yeah, but you see, what are you talking about, this old history, let bygones be bygones. Well, I agree. You see, fact is that today it is a Hindu site. Hindus go on pilgrimage there. No Muslim ever goes on pilgrimage there. So the logical thing to do, whatever the history of the site, is you just leave it to the Hindus. Very simple. Like you leave Lourdes in France to the Catholics. No questions asked. We may not believe their reason for holding the place sacred, but You know, this is a secular state. You know, we don't meddle in religion. Okay, in 1983 came into being the movement for the liberation of Rama's birthplace. This was led by three people, of whom two are mentioned there, two congressmen, a local member of the Legislative Assembly, Daude Al-Khanna, and an ex-prime minister, Gulzari Lal Nanda, who was the prime minister after Lal Bahadur Shastri died, I believe. So before 1970. And so before Indira Gandhi actually came to power. So it's not a BJP affair. Let that be clear. And indeed, Congress was favorable to the building of the temple. And you can see that at that time, Rajiv Gandhi made a few concessions to the Muslim leadership, like the Shah Bano overruling of the court verdict by a new law, or the banning of the satanic verses by Salman Rushdie, because he had in mind, okay, these things can serve as a counterweight against the concession to the Hindus, namely that they are going to get this site. So that was normal Congress horse trading. It's not very noble or very principled, but at least it's practical, it gets results, it's bloodless. And when I now look back, I think that the BJP should have cooperated with that. You see, if the dominating section of Congress, together with the BJP, pursued the same policy with the same results, I don't think anybody could have stopped that. They are here on the back of this new book of mine. This new book is called Forever Ayodhya. So this is dedicated to the Kothari brothers who gave their life. I have visited their family, which is near here, suburb of Kolkata. And of course, the parents were proud and so on. Nevertheless, I was struck by the enormous sadness that hung over the place. And so I came away with the thought, well, you see humping and thumping about how heroic they are, that's all nice, but could this death not have been prevented? I mean, why are 20-year-old boys dying long before their time? You see, because politicians make them. And you can blame Mulayam Singh Yadav, who ordered the actual shooting. But maybe you can also partly blame the people who had let it come this far. So I think that if in the 80s the BJP and Congress had worked together, this could have been prevented. And it's not unlikely, it's not at all impossible. Sometimes you have people working together across party lines. Like right now, for instance, in the past 10 years under the Narendra Modi government, you have cases where opposition parties voted together with the BJP. This sometimes concerns really important policy decisions. In 1991, India was virtually bankrupt under Narasimha Rao and the finance minister Manmohan Singh. India had 9 days left to pay the salaries of its personnel, and then it was bankrupt. And so the only thing to do was a very strict austerity program, but some sections of Congress or some parties allied with Congress were expected to take the opportunity to stand against the government in favor of their vote bank. You see, we are preventing the government from taking money from you, from imposing austerity on you, whereas this austerity was really a national necessity. Well, then Narasimha Rao called on Vajpayee, the leader of the BJP, that was then the largest opposition party, and they together saved India. That's essentially what happened. And so you see, this working across party lines is not at all far-fetched. This is what could have been done. Anyway, that's not what happened. So the BJP more or less hijacked the issue from Congress, 1989, and then street agitation starts with the Rath Yatra. State government of UP acts against it, so then you get this shooting and this death. The BJP wins the elections twice. In 1989, it goes from 2 seats to 86. And then in 91, it goes to 150 or so, many. And then it drops the issue like a hot potato. Meanwhile, what happens is that the VP Singh government, which was a anti-Congress government, but leftist government, falls, and a very, very minority government comes to power under Chandrasekhar, that is de facto controlled by Congress, by Rajiv Gandhi from inside the opposition. And so Rajiv Gandhi has Chandrasekhar call a conference of scholars to discuss the evidence. Now, Rajiv Gandhi's position had already been made clear. It would be the same position that Narasimha Rao would take in 1992-93, namely that the evidence should decide. If there was a temple, then there should come a new temple. If there was no temple, then the mosque should remain standing. But this round of scholars' debate is sabotaged by the scholars deputed by the Babri Masjid Action Committee. Nothing comes of it, though they issue, the 4 scholars that had been selected, issue a booklet a few months later called Historians Report to the Nation, where they claim to be independent historians, though their participation in the debate was precisely as employees of the Babri Masjid Action Committee. And so there they give their usual arguments that there is nothing to the story of the temple demolition. So the BJP discourse on Ayodhya was flawed. It focused on Hindu sentiments. If you read the language they used at the time, it's always that respect Hindu sentiments. Now, sentiments have no legal value. You see, this is not about Hindu sentiments. Hindus have a right to this place. This is their place. If you steal something from someone, nobody's sentiments are at issue. You know, this is simply property of the Hindus. Then they focus on this this one place in Ayodhya, whereas this one place in Ayodhya is only a sample. You see, a case of a very widespread phenomenon that concerns thousands of places in India and many more outside India. So that's why Sitaram Goel called it a toy. And they even were willing to sacrifice the demand for Mathura and Kashi. See, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad had demanded a handover of these 3 sites. So not as some secularist pamphlet said, you know, all the temples, because then that would indeed have been thousands. No, just a symbolic 3, because these 3 are important. Here also it is not the temples that count, but the place. You see, whether there is a temple or not, the Kashi Vishwanath is sacred to the Hindus. And so the BJP was willing to give up even those 2, simply because they wanted to get rid of this whole issue. They certainly didn't want to say, oh, we are against Islamic iconoclasm. No, they wanted to get it over with. They knew that this temple would get them a lot of votes, and that was it. And then, yes, you see, they make it a nationhood issue, as I already said. The national hero Rama versus the foreign invader Babar is a complete misstatement of the issue. It was claimed that the Hindus wanted to take a revenge for the alleged iconoclasm. Now, first of all, what you might, as most say, is that Hindus want restitution. Namely, they want all these thousands of destroyed temples back. Now, that was not the case, but okay, maybe some Twitter troll or so is going to formulate that demand. Maybe there are a few. But so even then, it's only about restitution. Revenge is something else. You destroyed thousands of temples of ours. Okay, we're going to destroy thousands of mosques of yours. That would be revenge. Yeah, so the sacredness here is in the site itself, not in the temple built on it. There's a difference between those 2 that is always papered over in secularist argumentations. You see, all these issues about returning sites are beside the point. You see, I think symbolically it's correct that this demand of these 3 sites is made, but in general, you see, what is important is to bring the Muslims back. And then they will bring their sacred sites back themselves. They will re-Hinduize the Jama Masjid. Every Muslim is a Sita, that is to say, an abductee, and must be liberated. I mean, if you want to make Rama relevant in this day and age, this is how. Bring back all the Sitas. So there you had the demolition. L.K. Advani was blamed for it. Now, of course, he didn't have anything to do with it. He was there precisely to prove to the secularists, we can control the Hindu masses. This mosque is going to remain standing. The crowd thought differently. They had lost patience. They had lost patience with the BJP because the BJP was obviously not serious about the temple anymore. They had also lost patience with the Supreme Court, which had promised a verdict before 6 December and hadn't kept its word. The demolition, many of the Kar Sevaks who were there, even today, deny that there was any preparation. They say it was spontaneous. That I disagree with. For them, it may have been spontaneous. Because you see, demolishing this old dilapidated building is not so difficult if you know how to. So one RSS affiliated engineer and a few more, technical minded people went to inspect the site and identified the locations where you had to attach ropes so that you could easily pull it down. And this was also politically supported by one of the RSS leaders. Now here you see, this is a secret. The RSS is always very secretive. To me, they opened up because I had supported Ayodhya. I got, a lot more contact with them than other Western scholars. But nevertheless, I don't know how true it is what they tell me. So I don't know who exactly was behind it. I know some who definitely were on the BJP line of not changing anything at the site, or not demolishing, but I don't know who was on the side of the demolition, except the person who was most explicit about it, namely Moropant Pingle. Of course, he's long dead. Most of this can't be found out anymore. at least not by interviewing the people concerned. So what followed was a crackdown on the Sangh Parivar. You should see Prime Minister Narasimha Rao's position at that point. He let it happen. He could have sent in the army to stop the demolition, but he didn't, which all the secularists have held against him. This Congress pen pusher, Manish Shankar Iyer, called him the first BJP prime minister. But this much is true, that he was in favor of the temple. I mean, you know, what he said was, it's the history that must decide. If there was a temple, then there should be again a temple. Now, he knew that there was a temple. It's only the eminent historians who claimed to know something else. So on the one hand, as a Hindu, he was happy that that the temple would now come up, because the one thing standing in the way was the mosque standing. And on the other hand, he was also happy as a Congress leader, because this put the BJP on the defensive. The BJP would get all the blame. So this accelerated the solution as far as he was concerned. A very important point is that it saved thousands of lives. The demolition was objectively a very good thing. Because if there had not been a demolition, the Muslim community would have been egged on time and again by their most extreme leaders, but especially by the secularists, to, you know, show their attachment to the mosque and to agitate more and more street riots, more killings, and so on. So after the demolition, there was a bit of violence, even terrorist violence on the Muslim side, with the terrorist attacks in Mumbai on the 12th of March 1993, which, by the way, was an internationally very important event, because it created a new form of terrorism, where in one city you have simultaneous bombings at a number of different sites, which is later repeated in London, in New York, in Delhi, in Srinagar, and so on. So it's a very important event, but it killed only a few hundred. That's bad, of course, but that's better than what would have happened if the mosque building had remained standing. Because from then on, you see, Muslims lost all interest. I mean, after all, it was a very artificial issue for them. They had never cared about this place. It's Hindus who go on pilgrimage there, not Muslims. Then Advani had so little to do with it that he even called it the blackest day of my life. And so the BJP took his hands off of it. Anything that happened after that is not the doing of the BJP, so it's a very long trial. The High Court of Uttar Pradesh looks into the evidence. The evidence is very, very clear. It also calls the eminent historians to the witness stand. Why did you say there was no evidence when obviously here we see all the evidence? And so they all collapse. They hadn't even prepared to save their face. You know, I don't know what they could have said to save their face, but this was not it. You see, they said openly, oh yeah, but I didn't know, you know, I've never researched it. I only signed because the others did. And so it was embarrassing, but of course nobody knows, because the press has kept this news completely out of the reader's view. On 30 September 2010, the court gives its verdict. It recognizes that there was a temple there, and it gives the site itself to the Hindus. A nearby surface is still kept for the Muslims, but the site itself becomes Hindu. And then the Supreme Court hears the case, The Supreme Court is, of course, a hotbed of secularism, is in no mind to leave the place to the Hindus, but then they are constrained by the earlier verdict, which is based on very strong scholarly evidence that the Supreme Court just can't ignore. So they do something else, something that Indian judges are very good at, is to postpone. They also try to impose another solution out of court. They themselves say, yeah, but this should be an amicable solution, and so we prefer not to sit in judgment on it. Now, what is this, you see? It's their job to sit in judgment. That's what judges do. They have received this court case. This has come to them, it's their job to pronounce judgment. And so there is one merit. So in 2019, on the 9th of November, they confirmed that this is a Hindu site. The only material difference is that they also leave a little patch to the Muslims, but at a greater distance, so that, the pilgrims don't have to meet one another and run the risk of more riots like in the past and so on. So in fact, it should be the end of it. The issue that now concerns us, when we look back over these 69 years that the trial lasted, what could the BJP have done better, or what can it still do now after all these years? So it should place this particular case in the larger context where it belongs, namely the problem of Islamic iconoclasm. Then they started rebuilding the temple. That's almost complete now. A interesting moment there was the Bhumi Puja, when they started the work. This took place on a date that astrologers don't find auspicious. Now, I don't know about astrology and so on. The rule that they apply, even I understand, namely that an enterprise that you want to prosper, you should not start on the waning moon. You see, it should grow just like the moon is growing. And yet, this building of the temple was started on a day of the waning moon. Why? Well, it's the second anniversary of Modi's probably most glorious moment, when he abolished Article 370, the special status of Kashmir. So traditionalists said he makes a really important issue like the Rama temple subservient to his own self-glorification. This is a complete replay of what Lord Mountbatten did in 1947. You see, he had opted for partition in March 1947, and so he had some time left. In fact, there was nothing definitive about that date. Most people thought that India would become independent in 1948. And if that meant a better preparation, that would have been a very good thing. And so he could have prevented most of the killing that accompanied the partition. And so now he did none of that because he wanted to celebrate the second anniversary of the most glorious moment in his life, namely when he, together with the American General Douglas MacArthur, received the capitulation of the Japanese in August 1945. And so that's why this capitulation on 15th of August 45 is the same date as India's independence date. But astrologers back then already said this is a bad day because the waning moon. You see, India as a state is not going to prosper because the stars are negative. And so here also the traditionalist, Dharmacharya said, well, this temple is not going to prosper because it started on the waning moon. Now, personally, you see, I've never cared about whether something I started was started on the waxing or the waning moon. But if that is the rule in Hinduism, well, then why not respect it? I mean, after all, if you wait for another week, you'll have the waxing moon. So what's the problem? And so apparently the problem was that Modi was so attached to that particular date. It is very close in type of problem as what happened around the Kashi Vishwanath, which was redone, which was made far more accessible and pleasant for tourists, but much less authentic for pilgrims. Like, for instance, many of the houses around the Kashi Vishwanath that have been demolished now had inside themselves small temples. The same thing I have personally seen in Ayodhya, close to the Ram Janmabhoomi. There are houses that have temples inside. Why? Well, because Hindus kept coming as close as possible to the site. And so they couldn't offer their puja at the site itself. Well, then they had these little temples nearby. So, you see, even for tourist purposes, not only for pilgrimage, even for tourist purposes, you could showcase these temples. Look, you see here, this is Hindu devotion. This is what happened in difficult times. In Amsterdam, there was a period of Protestant persecution of the Catholics. And so the Catholic minority had house churches. They had their Eucharist every Sunday morning inside somebody's house. So they had house churches. Today, if you take a trip around Amsterdam as a tourist, you are shown these house churches. So, I mean, that is less important, but if you think tourism is that important, well, you should consider that also. So at any rate, the whole philosophy of this government is very tourist-oriented, very business-oriented, and so on, is not at all respectful of Hindu tradition. That is one of the issues that now is coming to the fore, now that this Hindu-Muslim conflict is past. Okay, this is more or less what I wanted to say. Very soon the new temple will be built. I, of course, have to warn that it is very much a target for terrorists. Fortunately, this one very good thing the Modi government has achieved, the terrorism problem is much, much less than 10 years ago. But nevertheless, it only takes one terrorist, with good material, and, he can destroy this temple. So you have to be careful, and other things may happen, but this in particular, we have to worry about. So this temple will have all these metal gates and all these controls, like you're boarding a plane in an airport, all these controls. So that's a pity, but for the time being, that's how it's going to go. Okay, so I wish you great fun with this new temple, and let's conclude with Jai Siya Ram.
you mentioned that the demolition team was led by Moropanta Pingle. The Babri Masjid demolition team was led by Moropanta Pingle. That's what
Yes.
you mentioned about. I have full suspicion
What?
that I suspect
Yeah.
the team which demolished the Babri Masjid, majority of them that time this Bajrang Dal just started activity, and many of the people who were leading were from the city where Narsimha Rao was born. That's what my understanding.
Possible. What I know is most of the boys hadn't expected this happy outcome. And so after demolishing the building, they took a few stones with them as trophies so that the whole ground was cleared by the time the fun was over. Yes, what more can we say about who did it? So Moropan Pingle is not the one who did the technical preparation, but he gave the political okay. And so there was the technical work, and then there was the spontaneous work by all the boys who were there, like one of the present VHP leaders, Swami Vijnanananda, was back then one of the militants on the ground. So I mean, at that level, you see, many people are still alive. They can still be questioned. But so of the leaders, practically no one is alive anymore. I don't know what the status of L.K. Advani. But so because of their prejudices, journalists are not going to ask the right questions. So there's a lot of information that is slipping away. Yes.
Hello, sir. My name is Manish Kumar Sharma. I'm a PhD scholar at HSS IIT Kharagpur. So I just want to know that two issues are going on. The first one is the Gyanvapi, and the second one is Mathura temple. So are you researching these two issues also, and what do you think it is going to take the course in future? Are we going to get some conclusive results out of it? What do you think?
Well, I am not really researching this. I'm following it. Like there is a research book by Meenakshi Jain about the Krishna Janmabhoomi. So there are some strange, exciting developments there. And it is quite possible that, some of the strange local, peculiarities of the case, it can be won through the court, even in spite of the Places of Worship Act 1991 that freezes the religious status of all these places as in 1947. Then there is also a court case going on about Kashi Vishwanath. Subramanian Swami is also having a hand in it. So there too, it's thinkable that that place will be handed over to Hindus ultimately. But so personally, I don't research that anymore because there are not so many Hindus who are doing it. There's a whole new generation of Hindu historians who, unlike in the past, do dare to face these questions. And so I leave that to them. Also, because as a matter of personal choice, the whole issue of Islamic history interests me less. Why? Because we know what happened. We know why it happened, and of course you can fill in details, and somebody should do that. And fortunately, there are enough people who are doing that. Like you have these, all this wonderful detailed new work by Abhas Maldahiyar, by Dimple Cole, by Sandeep Balakrishna, and so on. So you see, they are doing far more work than I could hope to do also at my age. So now I am more busy with what lies behind, you see. Why did this happen? What ideology made this happen. But so I'm quite confident that at least at the level of history writing, everything that needs to be done is now being done. The kind of sabotage that the scholars had to face 30 years ago, that is not really happening anymore. Not that the eminent historians have given up, or at least the next generation, and they still hold all the cards in the universities and so on. But you see now, not that Hindus did anything to deserve it, but something has happened that is very much in their favor. It's simply the development in information and communication technology. You see, you now have the emergence of a so-called Hindu ecosystem. You have a number of online papers. You have video channels and so on. So all the information is right away at a mouse click for everyone. That's a big difference. In the 90s, it was very difficult to get the information out. And so that greatly stimulates research that takes on the issues that are important for Hindu society.